You are a woman in the year 1830, standing in the cold morning light of a marketplace in Yorkshire. The cobblestones beneath your worn boots glisten with frost, and your breath forms tiny clouds in the air. Around you, the murmur of voices grows louder, but it is not excitement you hear, rather something entirely different, a feeling that twists your stomach with an uneasy blend of fear and fragile hope. Around your neck you feel the coarse scratch of a rope noose, like those used for livestock. Your husband John's rough hand holds the other end tightly as his voice carries across the square with the tone of a man auctioning a prize cow. "What am I offered for this fine woman?" he calls out, his words slurred slightly from the ale he swallowed at dawn to steady his nerves. Strong back, good teeth, able to cook and sew, the crowd draws closer, their expressions a mix of curiosity, disgust, and calculation. Some men step forward to examine you as if you were an animal at an auction, checking your hands for marks that show you can work, looking at your face to judge if you are attractive enough to warm their bed. You stand there, heart racing, knowing that within minutes your entire life will shift. You might be claimed by a man kinder than John, or you may find yourself in an even darker fate. Yet what terrifies you most is that this is not illegal, not some secret crime committed in desperation or madness. This is reality, public, accepted, and chilling in its finality. In the distorted reasoning of your era, your greatest opportunity for liberty and your sole chance for divorce lie ahead. Before we delve into these overlooked tales of endurance and hardship, if you enjoy uncovering concealed historical facts, consider pressing the like button and subscribing for more videos like this, and please share in the comments below where you are watching from. It amazes me that we are examining these ancient narratives together from various corners of the globe, united across time and space by our mutual fascination with history. The practice known as wife-selling did not arise from cruelty alone, although cruelty undoubtedly played a part. It originated within a legal framework so harsh and unyielding that it deprived the impoverished of any alternative. To grasp why hundreds of Victorian men brought their wives to public markets with ropes around their necks, we must enter a world where women were not regarded as individuals, but as possessions. In Victorian England, the legal principle of coverture meant that once a woman married, her entire identity vanished. As the famous legal expert Sir John Blackstone stated in 1753, the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage, or at least is consolidated and incorporated into that of her husband. She transformed into what the law termed a feme covert, a concealed woman overshadowed by her husband's legal persona, like she did not exist independently. Imagine wearing a cloak of invisibility, much like Mary Johnson, a fictional yet representative working-class woman from the early 19th century. Before she was married, Mary could legally own property, sign contracts, and even take someone to court. However, the moment she recited her wedding vows, everything shifted. Her earnings became her husband's possession, and any inheritance from her parents was transferred to him as well. If Mary decided to start a small venture, such as selling bread or doing laundry, every cent she earned was considered his property. Even the clothes she wore belonged to him. Suppose her husband John chose to abuse her severely. The law offered her very little protection. A man was legally entitled to discipline his wife as if she were a child or a dog. If John squandered their rent money on gambling or alcohol, Mary had no legal means to reclaim it. If he contracted diseases from brothels or refused to work while she labored tirelessly, washing clothes until her hands bled, the law regarded this behavior as his right as head of the household. But what happened when Mary reached her breaking point? What was the recourse when John's punishment resulted in broken ribs, or his drinking caused their children to go to bed hungry each night? What if Mary found comfort in someone else, maybe a compassionate widower who treated her with kindness or a bachelor who showed genuine care? Among the wealthier classes, divorce existed, but was prohibitively costly and complex, making it practically accessible only to the elite. Before the year 1857, obtaining a divorce was a near impossibility for most women. Obtaining a divorce once demanded a private act of Parliament, a procedure costing no less than £1,000, which today would be roughly equivalent to £118,000. At that time, this amount surpassed the total income that most working-class families could hope to earn over their entire lives. Even after the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857 made divorce somewhat more attainable through the courts, it still required about £40 more than a laborer's annual earnings. For impoverished individuals, there were basically only 5 ways to dissolve a marriage. Couples could separate by mutual consent, but this meant neither partner could legally remarry. Alternatively, one partner might desert the other by vanishing unexpectedly, hoping the spouse would not find them. Another option involved seeking a legal separation through ecclesiastical courts on the grounds of adultery or severe cruelty. But this was costly and did not permit remarriage. Death was a possibility, and given the harsh living conditions faced by the working class, it was unfortunately common. Lastly, there was the practice of selling one's wife, which appeared sometime in the late 17th century, likely born out of desperation and supported by popular beliefs. Since the law considered women as property, some reasoned, why couldn't that property be transferred like any other? This custom evolved into a ritual both degrading and oddly dignified, a grotesque mimicry of divorce and remarriage combined into a public ceremony. The sale usually began with an announcement in the local newspaper, and these notices often read like, "At livestock auctions, John Smith would sell his wife Mary Johnson at Doncaster Market on the upcoming Tuesday. She was healthy, robust, and of excellent character. No reasonable offer would be declined." Occasionally, these advertisements took on a more personal tone. For example, Thomas Brown, tired of his wife, announced he would part with her to anyone willing to take her off his hands. She could wash, cook, and milk cows. On the scheduled day, the husband would lead his wife to a public location, usually a market square, where farm animals were typically sold. Sometimes a tavern or a public house was used instead. This was not accidental. The symbolism was striking and harsh. The wife wore a halter around her neck, arm, or waist, commonly made from rope, but sometimes crafted from ribbon as a faint effort to preserve dignity. This halter was not merely symbolic, it marked her as property to be handed over, no different from cattle or sheep. The auctioneer, often the husband himself, would call for bids. He might say, "What am I offered for this fine woman? She is 26 years old, capable of bearing children, skilled at needlework, and has all her teeth." The crowd would gather closer, men scrutinizing her like potential buyers at a horse market. They inspected her hands for signs of labor, examined her face for beauty, and sometimes requested she speak to assess her comportment. Yet here the historical records show a vital detail that reshapes our perception. In most instances, the sale had been prearranged, and the buyer was frequently the woman's. A lover and the sale functioned as a combined act of mutual divorce and remarriage in a single public event. The disgrace was undeniable yet purposeful, since it made the separation open to witnesses and, in the minds of those involved, legally effective. Consider a case reported in Brighton in 1826, one of the true stories that inspired Thomas Hardy's well-known novel The Mayor of Casterbridge. A man led his neat and orderly woman to the market and sold her for £5 to a sailor. The newspaper noted that she appeared quite willing to go, and that the exchange was carried out in a cheerful manner. The sailor had probably been courting her for many months, and all three parties viewed the sale as their only legal way to end one relationship and start another. In Lock Market in 1830, a wife sold for 2 shillings and sixpence insisted that the deal proceed despite her husband's last-minute hesitations. She turned to his face and said, "Let be your rogue. I will be sold. I want a change." Her words resonate across time, reflecting her strong will to grab whatever control the law permitted her. The prices paid ranged widely, from as high as £100 plus £25 for each child, which would be more than 18,000 in today's currency, to as little as a glass of ale. Most sales were between 2 shillings and sixpence and 5 shillings, roughly equivalent to 20 to 50 in today's money. However, the amount was not truly important. What held significance was the public nature of the transaction. The transaction took place in front of dozens, sometimes even hundreds of witnesses, who could later confirm that the woman had been lawfully passed from one man to another. The halter itself carried significant symbolic importance. After the sale was finalized, it was handed to the new husband as a sign that the transfer was complete. This was not mere performance, but a desperate effort to establish legal recognition where none formally existed. The participants had to believe in the process and persuade their community that what they were doing was valid. Occasionally, the ceremony became more complex, with official bills of sale composed and signed using terminology borrowed from real estate transactions. For example, John Parsons declared, "For and in consideration of the sum of £6 and 6 shillings in hand paid, I do sell a sign and set over unto John Tucker Ann, wife of the said John Parsons, with all rights, claims, services, and demands whatsoever, during her natural lifetime." The event often concluded with everyone heading to the nearest tavern to celebrate a wedding feast funded by the new husband. Church bells might ring, as recorded in one instance from 1827, adding to the communal spectacle. The local population, hungry for entertainment and intrigue, treated these ceremonies as public events. Crowds numbering in the hundreds gathered to watch the sale, experiencing it as a blend of theatrical performance, legal procedure, and festive carnival. However, it is important to recognize that not all wife sales involved willing partners seeking social validation. Some were far from consensual arrangements. In March of 1766, a carpenter from Southwark sold his wife in a moment of marital neglect at a tavern. When he regained sobriety, he asked her to come back, but she refused, and in despair, he took his own life. This tragedy highlights the dreadful predicaments caused by these legal constraints. By 1824 in Manchester, a wife was sold for 5 shillings, but, dissatisfied with the buyer, she was put up for sale again at 3 shillings and a quart of ale. The woman had a say in the matter. She could reject buyers she found unacceptable. However, imagine the horror of standing as strangers bid on you like property, knowing your destiny depended on the highest bidder. The custom was especially common in Yorkshire, where over 1/4 of the documented 108 wife sales during the Victorian era occurred. In May of 1837, a blacksmith called John in Halifax sold his wife for a shilling, bought her back, then sold her to a married man for half a crown. When the wife discovered this, she fiercely attacked her unfaithful husband, clearly indicating she had not agreed to these deals. The more complex sales could attract huge crowds. For instance, in December of 1849 in Goole, a man named Ashton learned his wife had run off with her lover while he was hospitalized. They traced them down and organized a public auction where the Yorkshire spectators gathered to witness a voluptuous young woman being sold. She was won by her new companion for 5 shillings and 9 pence after a brief, lively bidding battle. Before leaving with her new partner, she snapped her fingers at her former husband and said, "They're good for naught, that's more than you would fetch." Even children were involved in this market. Wives were occasionally sold along with their children, included as part of the deal. For instance, in one case in 1865, a woman and her 2 children were sold for £100 plus £25 each for the children, a sum equal to several years' earnings for a laborer. The purchaser was taking on not only a wife but an entire household, embracing all the economic obligations attached. The authorities had a mixed and often bewildered reaction to the sale of wives. Legally, the custom had no standing. It was effectively a conspiracy to commit adultery, often followed by bigamy once the new couple wed. However, many local officials appeared unsure about their power to stop the events. In 1819, when a magistrate attempted to halt a sale in Ashbourne, Derbyshire, he was met with stones and chased away by the crowd. Later, he confessed his doubts about the very act of selling. "I do not think I have a right to prevent it, since it relies on a tradition maintained by the people, which could be risky to abolish through legal means for that purpose." Some hesitated, recognizing the complexity of interfering in such customs. Local authorities frequently supported this custom. Poor law officials charged with caring for the destitute in workhouses occasionally compelled husbands to sell their wives instead of allowing the parish to provide for separated families. In 1814, John Cook was forced by the Effingham workhouse administrators to sell his wife rather than have the parish care for her and their child. She was taken to Cudden Market and sold for 1 shilling, with the parish covering her travel expenses and a wedding celebration meal. The symbolic significance of conducting these transactions in marketplace settings cannot be overstated. Markets were places where animals were exchanged, property was traded, and the community assembled to observe such exchanges. Selecting these venues meant that the individuals involved brought their intimate personal matters into the most public commercial environment possible. They insisted that their society witness and legitimize what the legal system refused to acknowledge. However, the symbolism extended beyond the location alone. The rope tied around the woman's neck made overt what the law only suggested, that wives were possessions equivalent to livestock. Some sales even determined the price of women based on their weight, exactly as animals were priced. This was no mere metaphor. It was a direct consequence of existing legal principles. This custom started to diminish during the 1840s when social perspectives evolved and divorce became somewhat more attainable. Newspaper reports increasingly condemned these sales, calling them revolting. Shameful and disturbing scenes unfolded as the emerging middle class grew increasingly uneasy with public demonstrations they considered to be crude and uncivilized behavior of the working class. By the year 1850, there was a stronger push for legal action against such acts. More transactions were carried out in private through formal agreements rather than in open auctions, as those involved aimed to preserve the appearance of legality while avoiding public disgrace. Religious and social reform groups also sought to end the practice. The Salvation Army, along with other evangelical organizations, condemned it. Yet oddly enough, in 1889, a Salvation Army member sold his wife for a shilling in Hucknall, Nottinghamshire. Even reformers at times were unable to fully escape the harsh circumstances that made wife-selling appear as a practical solution to unbearable dilemmas. The last documented wife sale in England happened in 1913, when a woman testified in a magistrate's court that she had been sold to one of her husband's colleagues for a single pawn. By that time, this custom had become an outdated ritual sustained more by tradition and desperation than by any genuine acceptance of its validity. However, the deeper horror of wife-selling did not lie in the ceremony itself, but in what it exposed about the society that forced it upon people. These were not wild traditions carried out by uncivilized people. Instead, they represented the logical choices of sensible individuals caught in a senseless system. When the law provides no solution for unbearable circumstances, people invent their own fixes, however dreadful they might seem. The women standing in those market squares, with their fate essentially sealed, bore the heavy burden imposed by such an unforgiving world. The halters worn around their necks symbolized more than just the cruelty of their husbands. They represented victims of a legal system that refused to acknowledge their humanity. These women were caught between a legal fiction that erased their existence and a harsh reality demanding they find ways to survive, escape abuse, and pursue happiness. For some, the degrading spectacle of wife-selling became that means of escape. They endured the shame of being auctioned like animals because it offered something the law would not, a second chance. For a modest sum and the sacrifice of their dignity, they could legally become someone else's possession, and if fortune smiled upon them, that new owner might treat them as a human rather than mere property. The crowds gathering to witness these auctions were not just seeking voyeuristic amusement, though entertainment certainly played a role. They acted as witnesses to a community wrestling with problems that the legal system refused or failed to solve. Their participation was a form of rough justice, exposing in public what private law kept concealed. Arthur Muni recorded observing this so-called fine old custom in a North Yorkshire village in February of 1860. An elderly man sold his significantly younger wife to a middle-aged buyer for 18 pence. The purchaser had pondered placing a bid and ultimately concluded that the act was appropriate and lawful, but the villagers... There was opposition as they burned an effigy of the couple on the village green, indicating that even in places where wife-selling continued, it remained a disputed and morally complex issue. This practice cut across social classes more than Victorian middle-class commentators were willing to acknowledge. It is said the Duke of Chandos bought his second spouse from an Oler around 1740, paying half a crown for a woman who had been mistreated by her previous keeper. After the first husband passed away, The Duke ensured she received an education and married her. According to all accounts, they shared a happy life together. Her final words to her household recounted her past and conveyed a moving lesson about trusting in Providence, implying that even among the aristocracy, wife-selling could result in genuine affection and respect. These narratives challenge our perceptions of what wife-selling represented for those involved. Certainly, it was demeaning and humiliating, and it treated women as tangible property in the most direct sense. However, it was also, in its distorted manner, a means of freedom. It provided an escape from unions that might have otherwise resulted in unending misery or even death. The historical evidence indicates that many wives were active participants in orchestrating their own sales. In Plymouth in 1822, one woman supplied the funds for her agent to free her from her marriage. In many other instances, wives demanded the sales when their husbands wavered. They were far from passive victims. Although they were traded against their will, they actively took part in the only form of separation accessible to them. This does not make the custom any less disturbing, but it helps us grasp why it continued for more than 2 centuries. Wife-selling was not merely about men getting rid of unwanted spouses, it was about families struggling to resolve impossible dilemmas using the only means they had. The wider context deepens the sorrow of this practice. This period was one in which a laborer could earn 10 shillings per week, where families crowded into single rooms without running water, where children as young as 6 toiled in factories for 12 hours daily. Life was harsh, brief, and full of limited options. Marriage for the wealthy might represent companionship and social mobility, but for the poor it was often just a financial arrangement. When that arrangement failed, when husbands squandered money on drink, when wives were unable to have children, when violence turned homes into places of suffering, the impoverished had no alternatives. The church provided ethical advice, but no practical help. The law imposed penalties, but no solutions. Only the rough justice of community-endorsed wife-selling gave an escape. Newspaper reports of these events, mostly written by middle-class reporters for middle-class audiences, frequently express disdain and moral outrage. They portray those involved as uncivilized and degraded and depict the spectators as the scenes appear brutal and voyeuristic, but beneath the surface lie stories of desperate individuals forced to make unimaginable decisions with as much dignity as they could summon. From our modern viewpoint, it is easy to see wife-selling as sheer cruelty and humiliation. The image of a woman with a rope around her neck being auctioned like animals hits us as the ultimate representation of female subjugation. And indeed it was that. Yet it was something more. It was a community's effort to deliver justice when the law provided none. It was the way desperate people seized control in a system designed to strip them of choice. The process was harsh, flawed, and frequently unkind, but it was also the sole form of divorce available to the impoverished. This practice vanished, not because society suddenly became more enlightened about women's rights, but because legal divorce became somewhat easier to obtain, and shifting economic realities offered women alternatives. The Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882 began to break down coverture by allowing wives to retain their earnings and inherit property. Gradually, very gradually, the law started to acknowledge women as individuals rather than possessions. However, for the women who stood in these market squares in the early 19th century with halters around their necks and crowds pressing close to inspect them like livestock, those reforms arrived too late. They lived in a world offering no legal identity or entitlement to their own income. There was no way out of abusive or unhappy marriages except through the humiliating spectacle of public sales telling their stories. These accounts remind us that progress is not guaranteed, and that the legal rights we now consider standard were fought for painfully and came at a tremendous price. They show that when official systems fail to deliver justice, people find their own methods of pursuit, however flawed or ethically troubling. As you enjoy your comfortable modern life with your legal right to divorce, your ability to hold property, and your recognition as a full individual before the law, think of the women who gained their freedom for just a few shillings and at the cost of their dignity in Victorian England's market squares. Remember that the rights you benefit from stem from the suffering of women who were forced to wear halters, and pray that someone, anyone, would treat them with more kindness than the law did. The fading echoes of those public auctions disappeared more than 100 years ago, but leave us with uneasy questions about the systems we have built and the people these systems fail. They remind us that behind every disturbing historic practice lie human stories of endurance, despair, and the relentless pursuit of a better life, even when that life comes with an almost unbearable price. The horror of wife-selling becomes even more tangible when we look at the specific details of how it was carried out. Imagine yourself back in that marketplace at dawn, observing the scene unfold around you. The morning fog still clings to the cobblestones, and the air is thick with the unmistakable sense of a livestock market, the earthy aroma of hay, the pungent stench of manure, and the sharp metallic smell that comes from animals who sense their impending doom. Yet today, the fear in the atmosphere does not come from the animals at all. The figure standing on the rough wooden platform is neither cattle nor sheep. She is a woman, someone's daughter, mother, sister. Her name could be Elizabeth, Sarah, or Mary. Names now forgotten, preserved only in faded newspaper clippings and court papers. She is around 28 years old, with hands toughened by labor and a face that might once have held beauty, now marked by the hardships of poverty and relentless toil. The rope tied tightly around her neck is not ornamental but a thick halter, the kind used to guide horses, rubbing harshly against her skin with every slight movement. On the other side of the rope stands her husband, soon to be her estranged spouse, gripping it with the practiced ease of a man who has done this many times before, though his hand trembles faintly from the morning alcohol meant to calm his nerves. "Come now, gentlemen," he hails, his voice cutting through the quiet square with grim familiarity. "What will you offer for this fine piece of woman flesh? She is as strong as an ox, can labor for 16 hours without a word of complaint, and she has a full set of teeth." He pries open her mouth with rough fingers to reveal her teeth to the crowd. Like a trader displaying his goods, the men gathered press closer, their breaths visible in the chilly air, their eyes calculating. These are not monsters, but farmers, laborers, and craftsmen who appreciate value and practicality. They inspect her hands for roughness that proves she can work, glance at her hips to judge if she is capable of bearing children, and study her face to decide if she is attractive enough to provide warmth on cold nights. A man, likely a blacksmith, judging by his apron stained with soot, steps forward and pinches her arm to test the firmness of her flesh. "She is rather thin," he comments clinically, "possibly unlikely to survive a harsh winter." He asks about her temperament, whether she is prone to outbursts or sadness. The husband replies swiftly, "She is sweet as a lamb when treated well, never raises her voice, does exactly as she is told, good with children too, having raised 3 of her own without losing any to illness. Yet something in the woman's eyes contradicts this description. There is a hardness there, a sharp intelligence that shows she is far from the meek figure being presented. Her lips are pressed tightly, and even though her hands are tied, the whiteness of her knuckles reveals clenched fists. She is not the helpless victim this scene portrays. She plays a role in a drama that might be her only chance at freedom. The bidding starts hesitantly with a call of 2 shillings as a cattle dealer tries to gauge the interest. The crowd scoffs, showing more disbelief than genuine interest, as the sum offered is scarcely enough to afford even a modest meal, just 2 shillings and 6 pence. A young farmer stands with a flushed face. Whether from excitement or nervousness it is hard to tell. He looks around 25 years old, bearing the awkwardness of someone unwed who views this moment as a chance to form a household. The woman's eyes flicker toward him swiftly, assessing him on the spot. Is he harsh? Does he drink excessively? Does John get violent when the ale makes him cruel on Saturday nights? Within these brief moments, she runs through calculations that might shape the remainder of her life. A voice breaks from the rear of the crowd, a man she clearly recognizes, Thomas Miller, a widower who has been secretly visiting her for months. Relief washes over her face so swiftly that a few bystanders exchange knowing looks. This is no ordinary auction, but a staged event, a performance created to provide legal standing to an agreement already decided. The young farmer, however, is unaware of this intricate play. He calls out eagerly, 4 shillings, believing earnestly that he is bidding for a wife. To sweeten the offer, he adds, "And I will include a pig as well." The woman's expression shifts to genuine fear. This was not the plan. Thomas Miller narrows his eyes and steps forward. 5 shillings, he asserts with a voice filled with warning that the young man fails to grasp. The farmer quickly responds with 6, caught up in the competitive spirit. The crowd starts murmuring with appreciation. The entertainment exceeds their expectations. A woman tries to catch her husband's attention to signal that something is wrong, but he is lost in calculating how much ale and gin 6 shillings could buy in his mind. For the first time, genuine fear appears on her face. She might end up with a stranger, someone potentially more ruthless than the husband she wants to escape. 7 shillings, John Miller says through clenched teeth. It is more money than he possesses, but he notices the woman's distress. The young farmer hesitates, patting his pockets. 7 shillings plus a pig is a considerable investment. He looks at the woman again, truly examining her face for the first time. Something in her expression finally breaks through his romantic illusions. She is not looking at him with gratitude or resigned acceptance. She is staring with the kind of terror usually directed at wild beasts. 7 shillings and 6 pence, he murmurs, though his tone now lacks certainty. The auctioneer senses the shift in atmosphere. The husband is drunk enough to feel greed, but not so much that he cannot perceive the dangerous tension growing among the crowd. Selling a wife depends heavily on the approval of the community, and crowds can quickly turn hostile when they sense something is amiss. "Going once for 7 and 6, he calls out fast, trying to end the auction before chaos erupts. 8 shillings, John Miller says desperately, although it is clear he does not have that sum. The moment lingers like a held breath as the woman stands frozen. Frozen in the space between her present suffering and an uncertain future. 2 men compete for the right to claim her as fully as one might claim ownership of a horse or a piece of furniture. The onlookers observe with a mix of curiosity and unease, as if witnessing something both captivating and unsettling at the same time. Then a surprising moment unfolds. The woman speaks. "I choose Thomas Miller," she declares, her voice ringing clearly across the suddenly hushed square. "I will go with him willingly, but I refuse to be sold to any stranger as if I were a sack of grain." The crowd bursts into murmurs and debate. This is not how wife-selling is supposed to operate. The woman is not meant to have a say. That is the very point of the auction system. Yet there is something in her tone, a quiet dignity that demands acknowledgment, even in this humiliating moment. Several men nod with approval. "She has spoken," an elderly man calls out from the edge of the gathering. "Let her be given to whomever she chooses. This is not a marketplace for animals." The young farmer contests, "But I offer the highest price," though his voice carries relief instead of anger. The husband glances around uneasily. He has lost control of the event he organized, and the atmosphere among the people is changing in ways he cannot grasp. The tradition of wife-selling persists because the community recognizes it as valid. Yet that validation relies on following some unspoken conventions. One of those conventions seems to be that the woman's wishes do hold weight. 7 shillings from Thomas Miller, someone announces. John quickly decides to cut his losses, and she agrees willingly, leaving no room for disagreement about the deal. Thomas Miller steps forward, holding money borrowed from 3 separate neighbors, his face showing both relief and embarrassment. Ownership of the halter formally passes from her husband to this new man, but Thomas immediately removes it from the woman's neck and throws it aside with clear disdain. The crowd bursts into applause as if they have just seen the satisfying end of a dramatic show, which in many ways is true. The woman, whom we will call Sarah, curtsies to the audience with more grace than anyone there deserves, then accepts Thomas Miller's offered arm. However, as the crowd starts to leave, the real price of this seemingly happy outcome becomes evident. Sarah may have escaped one miserable circumstance, yet she is now legally bound to Thomas Miller just as completely as she was to her first husband. If Thomas proves to be harsh or turns into a drunkard, Sarah will have no more options than before. She has simply swapped one kind of legal bondage for another, hoping that her new master will treat her with more kindness than her previous one. The young farmer who almost bought her watches them leave with mixed emotions. Part of him feels disappointed, realizing how lonely he had been to consider buying a wife as a sensible answer to his troubles. But another part is unsettled by what he has witnessed. Until now, he had never deeply pondered what it truly means to own another human being, a person being tied to another not through love or even mutual advantage, but by a legal construct that turned her into property. The former spouse of Sarah pockets his 7 shillings and heads to the closest tavern, already figuring out how many drinks he can buy. He experiences a strange blend of relief and sorrow that he cannot fully explain. Sarah had been a burden, certainly another mouth to feed, another individual demanding from his scarce resources. Yet she was the only person in the entire world who cared if he lived or died, even if that care was tangled with fear and bitterness. This particular scene is fictional, but is inspired by numerous verified cases displaying surprisingly similar patterns. The truth about wife-selling was far more complicated and heart-wrenching than the simple story of men getting rid of unwanted spouses might imply. Take, for example, the story of Mary Ann Price, sold in Merthia Tideville in 1837. The newspaper describes her as a young woman with an attractive appearance, led to the market with a new rope tied around her waist. She was sold to a man named Lewis for 4 shillings and 6 pence, yet the transaction was evidently planned beforehand. Lewis was called her sweetheart, and the sale seemed to be accepted willingly by everyone involved. However, hidden within the newspaper report are hints of a more profound narrative. Mary Ann's husband was said to be a coal miner. A coal miner who struggled heavily with alcohol addiction was involved in a sale that occurred during a time of intense economic hardship in the Welsh mining regions. Families were barely managing to survive on smaller incomes and inconsistent employment. Mary Johnson's decision to be sold was probably a choice between facing starvation alongside an intoxicated spouse or seeking survival with a man capable of supporting her. Consider the more unsettling incident from Carlisle in 1832, when a woman was put up for sale by her husband but declined all the offers made by bidders. As she kept refusing potential buyers, the crowd grew increasingly hostile, and the tension escalated to the point where the local magistrate had to step in to avoid violence. Ultimately, the woman was sold to a man she did not know for 3 shillings, but she refused to leave with him. The sale was deemed invalid, and she was permitted to return to her husband, although what happened afterward remains unrecorded. These events expose the core contradiction within the practice of wife-selling. This tradition relied on the legal fiction that women were property capable of being transferred at will, yet it also required the woman's consent for the community to accept the transaction. When a wife was clearly being sold without her agreement, it tended to evoke sympathy and occasionally intervention from the crowd, people who might otherwise watch the event with amusement. The pattern of wife-selling across regions reveals significant insights about the social and economic pressures that made this practice appear necessary. For instance, Yorkshire, known for its industrial towns and rural poverty, showed the highest numbers of recorded instances, while the practice was less frequent in the affluent southern regions and nearly non-existent in Scotland, where distinct legal customs offered alternative solutions for dissatisfied couples. In the industrial North, where long-established social frameworks were unraveling due to rapid economic shifts, wife-selling presented a means to adapt old traditions to new realities. Factory employment meant that families no longer functioned as unified economic entities working collectively on farms. Husbands and wives could be employed in different industries, follow separate schedules, and develop individual social circles. When marriages faltered under these stresses, conventional remedies such as community involvement or family pressure became less accessible. The symbolism of the halter uncovers the profound connections between wife-selling and livestock trading, but it also had a pragmatic legal function. English common law acknowledged various methods for transferring property, and the physical handing over of goods, known as livery of seisin, was among the oldest and most respected ways. By using a halter and finalizing the sale in a marketplace, those involved were invoking legal traditions that traced back to medieval times. The halter further served a psychological role for both sellers and buyers. For husbands, it made explicit what the law already suggested, that their wives were possessions to be disposed of at their discretion. For buyers, it represented their new rights and obligations toward the wife they acquired. Women themselves often recognized the moment when the halter was removed as a psychological shift from one household to another. Some of the most complex wife sales involved several transfers of the same woman. In Sheffield, in the year 1842, a woman was sold 3 times in a single day, as various men bid for her, but then changed their decisions each time. She had to suffer the embarrassment of being inspected by potential buyers, only to be placed back on the auction platform whenever a deal fell apart. The newspaper report notes that she grew increasingly distressed as the day progressed, eventually breaking down in tears when the 3rd sale was also canceled. These repeated sales highlight the deep instability of the whole system because wife selling had no legal foundation. There was no method to enforce agreements or settle disagreements. A buyer who reconsidered could simply return his purchase and ask for a refund. A woman who found her new circumstances unbearable had no options except to persuade her new husband to sell her yet again. The children of these sold wives were in a particularly sorrowful position. Sometimes they were included in the price like extras to the primary purchase. For instance, a woman sold in Pontefract in the year 1847 came with 3 children, and the buyer agreed to take on their care and education. However, more often children were left behind with the original family. Children were torn apart from their mothers through transactions that were far beyond their years to comprehend emotionally. The pain experienced by these children rarely appears in most historical documents, yet it is easy to picture the agony of witnessing your mother being taken away with a rope around her neck by a stranger who had just bought her. Some children never saw their mothers again, while others were reunited many years later in situations that were likely awkward and distressing for everybody involved. The custom of wife selling also deeply impacted the communities where it took place. These sales were public occasions that attracted crowds of hundreds, sometimes thousands of onlookers. They became a form of popular amusement, but also served as a platform for communal discussions about marriage, ethics, and the boundaries of acceptable conduct. The spectators at wife sales were not merely bystanders. They actively took part in a kind of rough justice. They could approve or condemn specific sales, intervene if they believed a woman was being mistreated, and raise their collective voice to uphold community values. If a husband like John attempted to sell his wife to someone the community saw as unsuitable, he might face disruption of the auction by hostile observers. Such community actions show that wife selling was not just about personal decisions or desperation. It was rooted in intricate social bonds and shared moral understandings. The practice could only operate with the backing of the community, and such support depended on adhering to certain unwritten expectations regarding fairness, consent, and respectability. The diminishing social standing of wife selling during the middle of the 19th century mirrored wider transformations within British society. The expanding middle class, which valued domestic privacy and moral integrity, grew increasingly uneasy with public presentations of working-class marital breakdown. Newspapers started labeling wife sales as revolting displays and cruel spectacles, language that exposed the class anxieties of a time when industrial capitalism was establishing sharp divides between honorable and dishonorable conduct. Religious revival movements also contributed to the suppression of the practice. Evangelical Christianity, emphasizing the holiness of marriage and the moral upliftment of the working classes, regarded wife selling as a sign of spiritual decay that must be eradicated. Methodist and Baptist preachers frequently condemned the act in their sermons, although their success in altering behavior remained limited. The legal system's reaction to wife selling developed gradually and irregularly. Prior to the year 1850, legal actions were uncommon and punishments minor, often involving only a few days of imprisonment or a small fine. However, as public opinion grew stricter, courts started delivering more severe sentences. By the 1860s, men found guilty of selling their wives faced harsher consequences. Wives risked facing 6 months in jail, and those purchasing could be accused of conspiring to commit adultery. Nevertheless, establishing that a wife sale truly took place was frequently challenging. The people involved had strong reasons to deny that any payment was exchanged, or to insist the event was merely a joke or a theatrical act. Juries, often composed of members from working-class backgrounds where wife-selling remained known if not approved, were sometimes hesitant to convict individuals for what they perceived as efforts to resolve impossible dilemmas. The rise of music hall entertainment in the mid-19th century gave wife-selling a renewed cultural presence, even as the actual custom was fading away. Popular tunes such as The Sale of a Wife turned the ritual into comedy, depicting the husband as naive, the wife as difficult, and the buyer as easily fooled. These songs softened the harsh reality of desperation and shame associated with wife-selling by converting it into harmless amusement for middle-class viewers. Yet, the ongoing presence of wife-selling in popular culture reveals something significant about its psychological and social roles. This custom addressed profound worries about marriage, property, and gender dynamics that did not vanish when the ritual itself became socially unacceptable. Songs from music halls, cheap novels, and later films continued to explore themes of marital collapse and repair that wife-selling had once confronted directly. The international aspect of the practice of wife-selling also demands our attention, as English settlers introduced it to the American colonies, where it continued well into the 19th century. Court records from various colonies, ranging from Connecticut to South Carolina, reveal cases that indicate this custom was adaptable to diverse social and economic environments. In certain contexts within America, wife-selling appeared to be more commercialized than in England, featuring official bills of sale and advertisements in newspapers. The French were especially intrigued by this phenomenon, viewing it as proof of British barbarity and moral decay. French newspapers frequently covered English wife sales, often amplifying the details to heighten drama. Political cartoons depicted John Bull dragging his wife to the marketplace like livestock, using the practice as a symbol of English cruelty and commercialization. This international scrutiny caused extreme embarrassment for English elites, who sought to present Britain as the pinnacle of European culture and ethical advancement. The notion that men in England casually sold their wives as if they were animals clashed sharply with the rising Victorian ideals of domestic dignity and female purity. As a result, government authorities started urging local judges to enforce stricter measures against the practice. The influence of alcohol in these wife sales must not be neglected, since many incidents began in taverns, driven by drinking and male bonding that made the humiliation of women seem acceptable or even entertaining. This recurring ritual was therefore tightly linked to the social dynamics of the time. Such events frequently concluded with everyone sharing drinks to mark the deal, a custom that made what might otherwise appear harsh or shocking seem more acceptable. Alcohol often served as a handy justification for men who later felt remorse about their decisions. There are numerous recorded instances where husbands sold their wives while intoxicated and then attempted to take them back once sober. The legal system typically refused to acknowledge these post-sale changes of heart, viewing the sale of a wife as a firm agreement, regardless of the seller's state of mind. The financial aspects of wife selling become more understandable when we compare it to other survival tactics among working-class communities facing chronic unemployment and wages barely covering basic needs. Marriage was frequently more about economic necessity than romantic connection. Women required the protection and support of men, while men depended on domestic duties and childcare that women provided. When these economic arrangements broke down, wife selling acted as a method to redistribute resources and responsibilities. The prices set for wives reflected these economic considerations. Women known as diligent workers, skilled in important trades such as spinning or brewing, fetched higher prices than those whose labor was less in demand. Factors like age, health, and ability to bear children also influence their market worth. The negotiations involved in these sales show that everyone involved fully understood they were trading not just a woman, but also her labor, fertility, and domestic contributions. Documents related to wife sales that have survived often reveal intimate details about the lives and values of the working class. Newspaper reports describe women's attire, their appearance, their abilities, and character traits. These sources capture the language used during sales, preserving snippets of working-class speech and perspectives that seldom show up in other historical records. The papers also expose the detailed rules that governed wife selling. There were proper ways to carry out a sale, certain places and times deemed suitable, and acceptable payment methods. Ignoring these customs could provoke disapproval from the community or even lead to violence. Although the practice might seem humiliating, it was not disorderly. Instead, it was guided by understood and generally respected regulations among those involved. The reduction of wife selling after 1850 was not merely due to legal crackdowns or growing social condemnation. Economic shifts made this tradition less necessary and less practical. Employment in factories provided women with some financial freedom, decreasing their total reliance on male providers. The expansion of cities created more chances for women to abandon unhappy marriages by simply leaving. The development of a railroad system made it easier for individuals to vanish and begin new lives far away. Changes in how people viewed marriage also contributed. The romantic ideals spreading through society emphasized love and mutual care as the essential foundation of marriage, reshaping traditional views in a significant way. The commercial elements surrounding the selling of a wife became increasingly distasteful as the nascent women's rights movement, although still modest and predominantly middle class, introduced new ways to consider gender dynamics and female independence. The last recorded instances of wife selling in England occurred in the early 20th century, by which period these acts were commonly regarded as remnants of a cruel and outdated custom. A 1913 incident in Leeds involved a woman who alleged that her husband had sold her to a co-worker for £1,000. Yet the circumstances remained unclear and the public's reaction was wholly disapproving. There was no gathering of onlookers, no formal event, nor any indication that this was an acceptable method for resolving marital disputes. By that time, legal divorce had become accessible to the working classes, although still costly and carrying social stigma. The Matrimonial Causes Act of 1923 would soon make divorce more attainable for women, offering legal solutions for some of the issues once dealt with by wife selling. Even though social welfare programs were limited, they provided alternatives to the harsh choices that had previously made wife selling seem like a feasible option. The impact of wife selling extends well beyond its historical context, revealing deep-rooted conflicts related to gender, ownership, and individual freedom. These tensions continue to influence modern discussions on marriage and divorce. This history highlights how legal frameworks can sometimes fail to meet human needs, compelling people to find their own resolutions. Solutions that some might find ethically challenging but practically essential are how modern audiences could interpret wife selling. Many might consider it a sign of past savagery and proof that society has moved beyond these crude forms of gender oppression. However, this practice emerged from particular legal and economic circumstances that left desperate individuals with no viable options. The women involved in wife sales were not merely passive sufferers, but active participants striving to better their situations with the limited means accessible to them. The crucial issue raised by wife selling remains relevant in the present day, and asks what occurs when legal systems fail to offer adequate solutions for unbearable conditions. Current parallels could involve undocumented immigrants denied legal protection, abuse survivors unable to afford legal help, or families devastated by economic policies favoring abstract ideals over human needs. The spectators of wife sales were not just seeking amusement, but engaged in community debates about fairness, ethics, and the boundaries of acceptable conduct. In today's more privatized world, some of the communal ways to address individual hardships have been lost, yet the hardships themselves persist. As we conclude this examination of one of history's most unsettling practices, these questions continue to challenge us. Customs bring us back to the market square where our journey began. A woman with a halter around her neck stood on the platform, while strangers competed for the chance to claim ownership of her. She symbolizes countless women who faced unbearable decisions within a system designed to strip away their autonomy. Some found moments of happiness in their new lives, developing genuine bonds with partners who saw them as people rather than possessions. Others realized that merely changing masters did not alter the harsh reality of their enslavement. Each of them suffered losses in dignity and self-worth that no practical gain could ever fully compensate. Their experiences serve as a powerful reminder that progress is not guaranteed. The rights and protections we often assume as given were forged through the pain of individuals forced to operate within systems that denied their humanity. These stories reveal that behind every historical practice, no matter how abhorrent it appears today, there were human beings striving to survive, seeking love, and creating meaning amid harsh conditions that offered few positive options. The halters have disappeared, the market squares have transformed into shopping centers, and the legal frameworks that once treated women as property have been overhauled. Yet, profound questions endure. How can we build systems that prioritize human needs over abstract ideals? How do we ensure progress benefits everyone instead of just a privileged minority? These are challenges we must continue to confront. Create communities where no one has to sacrifice dignity to stay alive. The women of Victorian England who wore halters around their necks and longed for kinder masters deserve more than to be remembered merely as victims of historical cruelty. They should be recognized as individuals who confronted unbearable situations with whatever bravery and determination they could gather. They found ways not only to endure, but sometimes to prosper in a society built to oppress them. Their voices resonate through the ages, reminding us that freedom comes at a cost, dignity is never assured, and the price of justice demands constant vigilance against systems and conditions that treat people as possessions. By recalling their stories, we pay tribute not only to their legacy, but also to our responsibility to prevent such impossible choices from ever being necessary again. The market squares stand empty today, yet the questions their lives raised about human value, fairness under the law, and the cost of survival remain as pressing now as they were 2 centuries ago. Within this urgency lies both a warning and a hope. A warning that progress can be undone, and a hope that learning from the past can guide us toward a fairer